All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining another DevTest Community Webcast. Today we're going to be covering the integration with DevTest and APIM. Our session today is going to be presented by Daniel Mazet, and he's the Associate Engineering Services Architect for the DevTest Product Group. If you have any questions as we're going through today's session, you can feel free to enter them into the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. We will also be opening questions up to verbal questions at the end of the session. So if you have any questions that you feel would be better reserved to ask over the phone, you can hold them until the end of the session when we open up for Q&A. I'm now going to turn the call over to Daniel. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. As Melanie mentioned, thanks for joining us. Today we're going to be looking at APIM integration with DevTest. Before we jump into the demo, I wanted to explain a few concepts. First, we'll introduce APIM and DevTest, and we'll see how they work together. I'll give you a brief overview of the demo architecture, where the pieces lay, and then we'll jump into a couple screenshots of the demo so that you can follow along a little bit better when we do the live demo, and then we'll see the live demo. So you'll actually see it twice. We find this helps kind of teach things a little bit better. And I'll try to keep this pretty quick. I won't take up the whole hour, and I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. Okay, so first things first, what is APIM? Well, this isn't a marketing spiel, right? I'm not going to try to sell the product to you, but I do want you to understand what these components are. So with APIM, there's this increasing amount of data and applications, mobile apps, cloud services, and APIs are behind all of them, and they provide a standard way to open up information across these assets. But the information needs to be safe, it needs to be reliable, sharing it needs to be cost-effective, and there's a lot of issues with security and performance and adapting the data for different services. CA makes it easier for enterprises to address these challenges. And this product called CA API Management combines the advanced functionality for the backend integration, the mobile optimization, the developer management, and it's very unique in its ability to address the full breadth of these challenges around API management. So that's APIM. There's a couple components to it. There's this gateway, this CA API gateway, and there's this policy manager, which is really the UI. So the gateway is, let's call it the working unit of the API gateway. It's an HTTP, JMS, and FTP accessible endpoint. And clients can access the gateway through a URI or a queue compatible with one of these protocols. And it functions as really a sort of reverse proxy for service requests. And it's the single web service traffic enforcement point in the network. Right, everything gets routed through the gateway, as the name suggests. We've also got the policy manager. This is the UI for the API gateway. So they're very closely tied together. It's usually hosted on the internal network, and it communicates with the gateway over some default ports. We use the policy manager to create a web service and XML application policies to manage users, configure ID bridging, and audit and monitor the gateway. So those are the components of APIM. For DevTest, well, you should all be familiar with DevTest. So I won't dive too deep into it, but there are some parts I want you to understand. SV App Test and CAI, these are all really components of DevTest, service virtualization, application test, and continuous application insight, or DevTest. We use them pretty interchangeably. You may have service virtualization or you may have application tests. Those are really specific ways to use this solution suite. Why do we use it? Well, DevTest eliminates common development and testing constraints, or bottlenecks or hurdles, whatever we're going to call them, right? And there are quite a few that we see, but the four that we see most often are system constraints, when we need a certain environment, we need an environment under a lot of load and we can't use it until the weekend, maybe a certain, a blackout window. Maybe it's cost, data or infrastructure costs. We don't have the correct data to run a test. We don't have the resources to build out a large infrastructure to replicate a real-world environment. Another problem we might have is parallel development. This is very common, where we're waiting on another team for something before we can do our job, maybe the chicken and the egg problem. All right, so instead of waiting in a serial fashion, a waterfall fashion, for one step to be completed before the next, we can kind of create these services before they really exist using SV and get around some of these bottlenecks. And maybe you have third-party limitations, something where you need access to a mainframe, and every time you hit it, there's a cost associated with that. And if you're going to run regression testing on it, that's a huge cost. Right? So if we can eliminate that, there's huge savings there. Okay, and now together, using them together. So how did DevTest and APIM go hand in hand? Well, let's say you're a developer who utilizes APIM to serve up your services and secure your services. And what you'll do is you'll get the request and the response to the services pushed over to DevTest to our database so that we can record them and generate virtual services to simulate services or build regression tests, right, to test your API. So we'll use the gateway to branch off and kind of mirror the writes over to DevTest. So let's assume we have DevTest, we have APIM, or really a gateway, right, and the UI for the gateway, the policy manager, and let's assume we have a service. So the policy in the gateway decides if you can access a service. The request goes through the gateway, but instead of going to the real service, maybe it'll go to the virtual service. Or if the virtual service doesn't exist, we can capture the transactions and create a virtual service. So those are some of the use cases around DevTest and APIM. Again, this is a demo, not a sales pitch, but I did want to share with you the plan, build, run concept. This involves DevTest and APIM. In the plan phase, you give developers a catalog of virtual services to help them accelerate development. It's a very interesting concept of the catalog of services that can be built over time and used within an organization. In the build phase, we support development and QA by switching between real services and virtual services, shaving off costs. This is where the true value comes from, right, is during the development and the testing cycles. And in the run phase, we can leverage API and virtual services to create critical services and really maintain the environment over the long term. Okay, so onto the demo. I just wanted to give you a visual representation of the architecture, how the communications works between the web interface, the APIM gateway, and DevTest. So we have a web browser running our cars, forward cars, it's our demo application. Okay, I'll use Chrome, and I'll navigate to our cars application. I'll also have the DevTest Portal running in the same browser. So we're going to access the application, which could be on a separate machine, could access the DevTest Portal from any machine. I'm just going to use one machine for this example, make it a little bit easier. They're both communicating to the gateway, which is capturing the transactions, okay? So their communication's routed to the gateway. And since we're capturing the transactions, we can use DevTest to create a virtual service, a test case, or troubleshoot, get more insight into these applications. And the reason you see web, ESB, loan, and inventory is because cars has multiple components, and we're using API calls to communicate between them. So when we see the transactions come through, we'll see them from different services. Okay, so quickly I'll go through these. You'll see this again, so if I skip over something or I go through something a little too fast, maybe I'll pause for the live demo and go through it again. Otherwise, feel free to take notes and ask questions at the end. But it's pretty simple. What you'll do is you'll log into the DevTest Portal. And on the top right of the screen, you'll see a username. In this example, I'm logged in as admin. And when I click on that username, I get a drop-down box where I can perform certain functions. And one of the functions is the APIM integration. So in the top right, you'll see that kind of gear icon. It says APIM integration. I'll click on that. It'll pop up a window for me. So the top window, the APIM integration, deploy a new policy window. This is really where you configure everything. This is it, basically. So there's a couple fields. I'll go through each one of them just to explain them so you know what they are. There's even examples here so you can see. In the URL field, we'll enter the URL for the gateway. Again, the URL field is the URL of the gateway. And we're going to use port 8443, and it's HTTPS. It's secure over SSL. And the gateway name can be anything. It doesn't have to be the host name. It doesn't really have to match anything. This is a descriptive name for you. So you can name that whatever you want. Then the username and the password field, those are for the gateway as well. So the URL, the gateway name, the username, and the password, this is all for the gateway. And then down below, we have the DevTest login. That's the username and the password for the DevTest portal or DevTest machine. The one thing to note here is that you can be a power user or an admin, but you can't be a runtime user. You need permissions of at least a power user to configure the integration. In this example, we're using admin, so we're good. Okay, and right below that, you'll see options, regular expression, and mode. Let me just talk about those briefly. These are kind of optional. By default, your mode will be record. In the record mode, we'll capture data. And the other option is do nothing, which is essentially, disable or pause capture. And we have that as an option rather than just deleting the gateway policy. So instead of just deleting the policy, we just pause it. Okay, so that's an option you can do once you deploy it as well. You don't have to do this now. Last part I want to talk about is the regular expression. So this is a filter, really. By default, the API calls in the gateway are going to be recorded. All of them are going to be recorded. So you can enter a regular expression here to filter out the API. So for example, you can put you can filter out garbage data that you don't want to capture that you're sure you're not going to want later. You can do the same thing also when you go to create a virtual service. You can filter out and select particular transactions, but sometimes it's easier to do it up front so it doesn't kind of clog up your screen. We're going to click deploy, and a sample policy will be created on the gateway, and we'll see the next tab to the right, the second portion of the screen. You'll see the deployed policy with the host name, the IP address, what you enter, the username, any filter that you applied, and the mode that it's in. That can be changed in real time. The status to make sure that it's up, the policy is deployed, and the option to delete it. Okay? So that's how you configure it. Pretty simple. Once we do that, we'll get a success confirmation, and what we'll do is we'll just double check. This is the API Gateway Policy Manager, and we'll just double check that the policy is in fact deployed. And what we'll see is this gateway-service virtualization. It's a folder here. It's a policy that gets deployed with some example services. Okay, and we can also check the connection information. If I go up here to tasks, I think it's manage cluster-wide policies or cluster-wide settings. I can see the information that we entered previously in order to connect to it. Okay, then what do? Once we've configured the policy, we're going to run our application and capture some API calls. So we invoke the API, we capture request response data. This is actually the Continuous Application Insight, CAI, part of DevTest. We'll capture the data and turn them into transactions. And we have to set the ESB. This is going to talk to the gateway. Okay, this is going to get us to speak with route everything through the gateway. So we're going to change our application to go to the gateway. Then we'll invoke the application, and we'll get some transactions here. So back in the portal, after we're done, we've got a couple of transactions here. It's a bunch of VIN lookups. Our cars application is really a car sales application. So this is us looking up a few different VIN numbers to see a vehicle history report, for example. Okay, So we go to the tab on the side that's called Application Insight. Then we go to Analyze Transactions. You see a list of the transactions. You'll see the agent is APIM-hostname or IP address. You see a few things like the start time when the transaction was captured and the name of the transaction. And you can filter this by certain time ranges. You can display only the APIM transactions or all transactions. But if you don't add a filter, this list could be very long, right? So as before, if you don't add a filter as a regular expression, you could have a very long list, multiple pages. So if you do know what you're looking to capture, it's best to filter through it then. Otherwise, you can do it here by only selecting certain ones. And once you have the transactions, what do? Well, we can click on a transaction. We see information about the request to the response. And what we do here is then we shelve. We'll click on the frame, and we'll shelve the transaction. And this is really the other step of that filtering, right? Selecting the transactions we're interested in. Okay, and why do we shelve them? Well, we shelve them to create baseline and virtual tests. We can do that right from the shelf through these shortcuts. So we open a transaction, we right-click on the frame, we shelve the transactions, and we go to the shelf, and then we'll see the transactions we shelved and the options moving from there. And just a second, I want to take the shelf concept is very important to understand. It's the sort of staging area in the DevTest portal. It's a workspace for active transactions that you want to use elsewhere, that you want to create from a virtual service or a test case from. Without the shelf, you would see that whole list of transactions, right? So this shelf helps us filter them out and just focus on the ones that are important. Okay, so then at this point, we create a virtual service from them. So that's pretty much the process. Let me go through now and start the demo. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So I've got DevTest running. I actually don't have I have DevTest running. I don't have I have Enterprise Dashboard, I have Registry, I have Portal, and Broker to capture the transactions. Machine's running a little low on RAM, so I didn't start the test or VSC. But I can still create those. I just can't run them. So let me log in. I can show you how this works. Okay. So we logged in as at least a power user or an admin. In our case, we did admin. I'll click up here by my username, and I'll get a drop-down box. We'll go over to this APIM integration, and we'll open this up. And you'll see it gives you an example for the URL for the gateway. So for us, actually have it here, I can copy paste it. HTTPS, SSL, IP or hostname, and then you'll need the port 8443. You can give it a name, doesn't matter what it is, call it APIM Demo 2. I think I already have a 1, the username for my gateway. Don't want to mix those up. Password. And the DevTest login. This is the one I'm just logged in with. It could be a different one. That's fine. And then I've got my filter. I'm going to show you just capturing everything so you can see what it looks like. This is where you would put in your filter. And the mode is record. We want to record, right? And I'll deploy it. So I'll click deploy. Might take a second because it's got to go to a different state. And after it gets deployed, we can go to the next tab to the right of deploy new policy, and we'll see our deployed policies. So we'll click on that, and we'll see the policy we just deployed. Again, with the host name, the IP address, the user, there's no expression we entered, and the mode. We can change it to do nothing. But we'll leave it record, and we have the option to delete it, option to check the status, okay? So I didn't change anything, but we can update that here. So let's close this. And now let's double check that we did indeed deploy it. So let's go to our policy manager. I'll connect. This is the gateway. Just make sure I have the right username and password, the right IP address. Okay. So now I'm just going to verify that the gateway has a policy deployed. DevTest, we used a couple API calls to deploy it. Looks like we've got the folder now, gateway service virtualization is in fact deployed with some examples, right? So that's good. Now what we can do is go to our application and create some data. So go to our forward cars application. What I'll do is I'll go to inventory search, and I'll just make sure the ESB is set correctly. So this is going to point to our gateway and port 8080. We'll set that. And now what I can do is I can do some transactions. So I'm looking for a car to buy. Let's say it's a BMW. Maybe it's a 5 Series. Okay, we'll take a look. That one looks good. It's got a mileage or one owner, 2009. Okay, let's do a accident report. Look up. Okay, looks good. So we've got some transactions now. We should be able to see them. So back in the portal, I'll go over here to Application Insight. And I'll go to Analyze Transactions. This is where our captured transactions will reside. And then on the top here, we'll see the ability to refresh, reload the transactions. We can filter them by when they occurred. Here we've got the last day. I can also do a filter by the agent. So if I open this up, I can see we've got the APIM agent here. I can click on that and just see the APIM transactions, or I can do that for different agents, right? Lots of things I can do here. I can also change the view. I can make it a graphical view instead of a list view, see the relationship between the transactions, all sorts of things. At this point, I have my transactions. We've got over here the agent. We've got the transaction time, 2:25. Yep, so this looks good. This is probably the first one. There's a couple inventories, so that looks good. And what do I do now? Well, I'll shelve the transactions, create a test, and a virtual service. So let's just take the first one, for example. Right, I can click on the transaction and get all sorts of good information about it. We'll see information about this frame here. We'll see the request, the response information. We'll see a different formats. We've got the headers. We've got exceptions. Okay. So lots of good stuff here. What I can do is I can go to the frame, hover over it. See, it's a REST call. I can right-click on it, and I could do shelve frame or shelve transactions. What it does now is it opens up the ability to use the shelf concept that we talked about before. So I shelve that frame, just that one frame. What I can do is I can go to the shelf, open up a new window, and it'll show me that frame in this new workspace. Gives me some information on like the agent, what kind of baseline it would create, what kind of virtual service it could be used to create. So I would do this for a couple different transactions. Let's just pick two here so that you can see. And I would have multiple frames here, right? Multiple transactions. And what I can do is I can create a virtual service from them. I can create a baseline. I can do a whole bunch of things. But let's do create a virtual service first. So I'll click on the icon. It's a little cloud icon. I'll just show you that again. Up here on the left, create a virtual service from shelved frames. It's a little cloud with a gear icon. Click on that, and this will walk you through kind of the virtual service creation wizard, if you will, right? We have the option here to treat the transactions as stateless, use a VRS file, but we're not going to do that because we have the transaction here. Gives you a visual representation of the agents. When you click next, it'll ask you what project you want to create them in. We'll use Bank 5, that's fine, and I'll give it a name. APIM is great, so let's leave that. We'll do create. You can also create and deploy, in which case it will deploy the virtual service so that you can run a test against it, for example, or transactions against it. And when I'm done, yeah, let's keep these shelved, the items in the shelf, because I want to go back and I want to create a test case, a baseline of it afterwards. So let's do finish. It'll create a virtual service for me. If I hover over the check mark, it'll tell me where it's created, and I can click here, and it'll open up the virtual service management window. The other way to get to that is up here by going to manage virtual services. Get to it that way too. And once it's deployed, I can go to monitor virtual service environments, and it'll be listed here. But this is the virtual service. This is our VIN lookup that we just performed. Let's go back to the shelf and let's create a test case. So if I go back to Analyze Transactions, I'll use the same one, or I could use a different one, but we'll open up the shelf. We'll click this bookcase icon up here. It's got the number 2, noting that there's 2 items in the shelf. So we'll click on that. There you can see it. We've still got them in the shelf because we left them in the shelf, and I'll click the second icon here, which is to create a baseline test from the shelved frames. So if I click on that, this is now the test case wizard, right? It's going to show me the frames that we're using to create a baseline test. And I can use things with magic dates and database validation. This is app test, application test functionality. That's part of DevTest. So I'll go next. It'll say, again, what project do you want to create on? This is more for organizational purposes. If you've got multiple people, multiple teams, maybe multiple projects you want to create to kind of manage them a little bit better. Maybe I could have a project called sort of Bank V5. Maybe I want to call it APIM, for example. But we'll leave it for now. Name APIM is fine, and I'll leave the items in the shelf. It doesn't really matter. So we'll create the test case. Once we create the test case, we hover over the check mark again, and we can see that it created a baseline test for the frames. So I can click on one to show you. There we go. And now we have the ability to, we can also go up here under Manage Tests, and we'll see them listed. Then we can run the test case from here. The other way I can do is if I want to see all of them, I can go to Manage Tests. It'll list them all out for me, and I can find them here. And then I can just go to the options and run them this way. Or I can actually go to the test itself and run them. Okay, so that's it really. That's APIM, DevTest integration, how they work together, how they're used together, the benefits of them all, and how it really seamlessly integrates. It has a nice workflow going from the APIM policy manager, capturing the transactions in DevTest, and then creating virtual services, and then test cases to test against those virtual services. So I'll pause here, and I'll see if there are any questions.
Just a reminder, if you do have a question, you can enter it into the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We also have the option to ask verbal questions. If you'd like to do that, you can click #6 on your telephone keypad to unmute yourself. We'll pause for just a second to allow questions to come in.
So while we're waiting, I do see one question in the Q&A. Do we need to register the DevTest admin or power user to APIM before we can deploy the policies? So no, you just need the gateway username or password. and you'll have a separate DevTest username or password. Okay, another question I see. During deployment, we are using a user for deployment. Where is the user managed? User management, okay. I can show you that real quick. So let me open up the portal, okay. Just for simplicity's sake, I'll go back to the home page. So you'll log into the portal, and you'll see the dashboard, and you'll see on the left all these kind of sections pop out. Now, we've done away in recent versions, this is 9.5, we've done away with the server console, which used to be our point to go to manage user accounts. Now they're in the portal. So if I go on the left here to settings, I can expand that. I can go to access control, and I can open up users. There's actually a lot of information in DocOps, DocOps, docops.ca.com. If you go to the DevTest section, you'll see a lot of information about authentication in that section. But here's where you would list the users. We have the ability to add a user or modify users as a power user. What I can do is I can change the password here. I can copy it, see information about his roles. So there's authentication and roles. You can also do this with LDAP, Active Directory integration, so you don't have to manage it separately in DevTest, but DevTest does have its own authorization and authentication. And these concept of the roles is really for the power user. So if we give someone the role of power user over here, that will be fine for the APIM integration.
Okay, and we do have another question in from Carl Carlson. He says, this is all done between the APIM gateway and DevTest, right? No need to deploy agents to app servers?
Correct. So what we've done is we've filtered all transactions. We've routed all the transactions through the gateway, and that's acting as a sort of right splitter, and it's routing all of the transactions to DevTest so that we can record them. So there's no agent required. So the application is going to the gateway.
Okay, thank you. We also have another question in from Dwayne. Are there any security considerations to use the continuous validation service with test cases created using Application Insight?
Do you want to explain that a little bit more, Dwayne? Do you have a specific use case in mind?
Dwayne, if you'd like to clarify, you can enter another item into the Q&A box, or you can click #6 to unmute yourself if you'd like to do it verbally.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to follow up. I know when initially when you set up the demo with Application Insight to use the tool to monitor capture the traffic, you went in and saw there was a configuration screen to enter the information to integrate with the APIM gateway. And I take it that's just for the Insight tool to be able to, I guess, capture the traffic back and forth.
Yeah, so I can show you that. So this information, there's a URL, username, password, DevTest login. This information is actually passed to the gateway. There we go. And it's recorded like this. There's key value pairs. So this is the mode, the record. This is the host name or the IP address. This is the username. So this is how this is what information is passed over. From that screen.
Okay. And so to execute the test again, I mean, we still have to deal with any of the security, API security?
So the gateway is going to be controlling that. The policy in the gateway is going to be controlling that.
Okay. So if I want to use like SOAP UI to hit the service that was created, by using SOAP UI, would I have to deal with any the API security, or since that policy was created, the policy will deal with that?
Yeah, the policy would deal with that. This is a default, so this one has a couple different things on it. This gets more into policy, APIM, policy manager, creating policies, publishing, web services, things like that. But this is where you have control to do that in the gateway. You can publish the proxy. You have full control over it through APIM.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Sure. I see another question about the agents. No, there's no agents required for the APIM integration, since everything is going through the gateway. Okay. Any other questions?
Okay, if there are no more questions for today, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Daniel. This was a great presentation. If you do think of any questions later on after you've already left the session, you can feel free to either ask anyone that's in the presenter line of this call, or go ahead and ask a question on the community. We're always there to answer any questions you guys have. I did put a poll up on the quality of today's webcast topic. If you guys could just take a second and let us know what you thought. We really value your input when planning out future sessions. Other than that, we have a few DevTest community webcasts that are planned for the future. You can head to the DevTest community and check out the events page to see those. Our next upcoming webcast is on October 26th, and that will cover what's new in CATDM 3.8. So if you're interested in any of those upcoming webcasts, you can head right to the DevTest portal on the communities and RSVP there. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for joining today. We appreciate having you on these calls, and thank you so much, Daniel, for the presentation, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.